the piece that I get to work on is our advocacy work. So I wanted to ask you guys, how do you define advocacy? Do you have any clue, or how do you usually think about advocacy?
I think it's maybe providing a voice for those that don't necessarily have one, like acting on their behalf.
Yep. It can definitely mean acting on their behalf. In fact, we oftentimes call our lawyers our advocates, right? An advocate in a legal case is someone that presents the case, argues for that person that may have been wronged. But also advocacy can include working with the people that are affected. So it's not just speaking for those that don't have a voice, but making sure those that are affected have a space to have a voice, making sure their voice is amplified. So there's lots of ways we can do that. We can do advocacy for people and advocacy with people. And sometimes it depends on what's the best way to achieve what we want to have at the end. Just to show you that different organizations in this area of work will have different definitions of how they do advocacy. So Oxfam is an organization that does a lot of advocacy, and they say it's the promotion of a specific message or a course of action in order to influence or contribute to the development and implementation of public policies which will alleviate the causes and consequences of poverty. A lot of big words, huh? ActionAid is another organization that works on advocacy. They say to work with the poor and the marginalized people to eradicate poverty and overcome the injustice and inequity that causes it. And another world vision we use more commonly in our offices would be advocacy as a ministry of influencing, using persuading people, dialogue, that's conversation, and reason, using logic and arguments to effect change. Advocacy seeks to address the structural and systemic causes of poverty by changing policies, practices, and attitudes that create inequity and deny justice. And to break that down a little more, usually policies, think about their positions. That a policy gives guidance. So it could be a law, it could be the law against trafficking. It's also the position that a government might take against that issue. It's how they address it, whether it's important to them, whether they put funding behind it, whether they have a lot of programs to address it, or just the laws that maybe aren't as much paid attention to. Practices, what happens, what actually gets done, because a lot of times we have laws, right, but we know they don't always mean that everyone's following them, and what are we doing about the laws that we have? And then, of course, attitudes and behaviors. You know, if you might have a law, but if no one really seems to be enforcing it or caring about it, it might not be important to that society. So policy and advocacy that I get to work on, we look at all of these things. We ask, what are the laws? What are the behaviors? What are people keeping their promises? You know, if the law is that all children are supposed to go to school, but in a community there's no school within 10 miles, does it really happen? And what are the behaviors? Maybe some of the attitudes in that community are, school's not that important, so we're not going to worry about sending our kids to school. So then you see there might be a law, but it might not be enacted and implemented. So policy and advocacy looks at all those reasons why there might be injustice, why people might be suffering from this unfair conditions, and tries to change and create solutions to those problems. It's really about the idea of promoting justice when we talk about being an advocate. And justice, and I think in U.S. society, we tend to think of justice as like crime and punishment. Do people get what they deserve? But this sense of justice, of how World Vision looks at it, is really much bigger than that. It's looking at how do we make things right? How do we free people up to be all that they were created to be, all that they're supposed to be? How do we change the systems around them, whether it's the laws around them, the cultural behaviors, the attitudes of people, so that there can be a right relationships between people, between society, so that we see justice. So it's much more than just punishing the bad people. But what's I think is really cool about this is when you are pursuing justice, you not only help the victim who might have something unfair and unjust happen to them, but you can also set people free from being the oppressor, being that bad guy that's doing the wrong thing. Because oftentimes I think people don't really know or don't see how their actions have consequences. And so sometimes when we educate people about what's happening because of laws or unfair practices, they can actually they can change things, and then they're no longer the ones that are causing that injustice too. So I think it goes both ways, and that's what I think is really exciting about it. So, I'd like to think of advocacy as like every time you've thought in your life like, that's so unfair, someone ought to do something about that. You get mad because something just doesn't seem right and you think something should be done. Advocacy is then doing something about it. It's about trying to make that change so that it's different. Advocacy, the way we do it, is really just about looking for problem solving. It's asking like, what are the problems? What are the root causes? Not just on the surface, but what deep down is causing this? What do we really need to go after to see real change here? The next one is about power. You spoke about talking to leaders. Oftentimes we need to think about, well, who has the power to change this? What is it going to take? Whether it's literally people in power like politicians or leaders or popular people like Oprah, or is it just enough normal everyday people coming together? Where is that power? Where is the votes? Where is the persuasion? And you try to figure out where that power is and how you can change it, persuade it. And then partnering is another really important piece, because no one person can do this alone. No one organization can do it alone. It really takes a lot of partnership. I mean, you look at, say, in the United States with civil rights movements, a lot of partnership between different groups of people, between church leaders and political leaders, different ethnicities coming together. It really takes all types of people sometimes to make a major change. So it's about finding out who are the best partners to see the change you want, and what do you have in common that you can work together for. I've worked in education areas, looking at how do you get children, especially one issue was children with disabilities, into normal schools. Because in a lot of countries, there's a lot of discrimination against people with disabilities, and especially a belief that they don't need to go to school, they cannot learn. I've seen places where literally a child doesn't have a hand, and there's nothing holding that person back from being able to go to school and function fine. But because of the stigma in that society, they might be excluded and they'll never go to school. So we've been trying to tackle that question in a lot of places. So in some countries it means really training teachers on, actually these children can go to school. They're just totally capable of learning. If you make these small adjustments, bringing more windows so that children with visual impairments can see better, small changes that you can teach teachers so that they can welcome those children into their classrooms. So that's an advocacy in the form of education and training. Another piece would be advocacy changing the community, because it's a lot of times the attitudes of parents or the community members that might keep the kids from going to school. So if you change their attitudes and say, actually, these are all the ways that children can still go to school, they can learn, you don't need to be embarrassed, like changing that cultural attitude. But then another piece would be changing the laws in a country specifically. So we've worked in a lot of different places with our staff in those countries to really influence the laws so that children are better included in schools. And that oftentimes is about just working with the people in power, the legal system there. And then at a national level, what I've gotten to do is there are a lot of groups that work through the UN and the World Bank to try to create standards for children's education around the globe. And so what we've done in the last couple of months is we worked with members from groups with the United Nations, groups with the World Bank, which provides money for a lot of countries to send kids to school, and other groups. We've come together and we've created, basically it's like a tool so that when governments are figuring out how much money they need and how to plan for all the kids in their country to go to school, that tool makes sure that kids with disabilities are included. And if they need extra money to make sure small changes are made to include them, that's also accounted for. So you can see, like, at a very personal level up to, this tool is used by people across the entire globe in multiple countries, and that will influence the people who are making decisions about who goes to school and who doesn't.